So we're going to end our day with the last two sessions. Our first one is going to explore powering our future. And organizing this session will be Dr. Wesley Reisser. He's a senior foreign affairs officer at the State Department and an AGS counselor. Wes?
As John said, my name is Dr. Wes Reisser. I'm a member of the AGS Council and also at the U.S. Department of State, where I work on a series of issues that have nothing to do with energy, but I've been teaching energy resources at George Washington University since 2009, and I'm looking forward to the release next year from Oxford University Press of the first ever interdisciplinary approach to energy resources that I've been working on with my brother for the last 3.5 years. I do have to caveat, as you've heard several other times from folks today, I am here in my personal capacity. Everything that I say is my view only and not that of the United States government. Keeps it a lot more interesting that way. And just want to very quickly introduce our other panelists. We're going to do this a little bit different than some of the earlier sessions. We've had a lot of papers presented to us, and we figured this late on the second day that we want to engage in a conversation with all of you. So I have a few opening questions for the panel, and then we will be opening it up to the floor after that to talk about this more. Our two other panelists are Ms. Cela, who is a leader in alternative energy financing in the United States, and in her role at Altus Power America, and before that at Smart Energy Capital. She's played a leading role in steering investments currently in solar power, but also has experience in the past in the wind industry as well. And our other panelist today is Dr. Phil Sharp, who's been involved in energy policy for most of his career, including during his 20-year tenure as a member of Congress representing Indiana, and in his work at the Kennedy School of Government, his leading of Resources for the Future, and many other ventures. Dr. Sharp now is here at Columbia University, and their International Energy Policy Center is co-sponsoring this conversation this afternoon that we're having. Few sectors out there are experiencing the rapid change that we're seeing right now in the global energy sector. Our session today is called Powering Our Futures, which could easily be the theme of an entire symposium, and even at that, we would barely be scratching the surface on what we're talking about. So today, we wanted to focus in on one specific aspect of that, which is electricity. Some of the biggest changes towards a more sustainable energy system are taking place in the electricity sector. Next year, when the theme of the symposium moves to mobility and transportation, will be a great time to talk about some of the changes in energy there. So we'll save that and other energy conversations for the years down the road. Quickly, before I turn to the panelists, though, I want to point to just a few facts and figures that will help ground our discussion today and help us understand where we are. So when we talk about electricity, we're talking about 39% of the total energy in the United States. It's the largest single sector within the American energy system. And it is a sector that is overwhelmingly powered by traditional fossil fuels. 37% of electricity produced in the United States last year was from coal, an additional 26% from natural gas, 22% from nuclear, 13% from renewables, and 1% from oil. Now, they don't break down the renewables on the Energy Information Administration website by electricity only, but they do give us a breakdown of that renewables sector overall. And so to give you an idea of what that is, and this is going to challenge, I think, where you expect to hear these figures, of the renewables sector in the US, 49% is from biomass, and that does include ethanol for transportation, but it also includes the burning of wood and trash to produce electricity. 25% is hydroelectricity, 19% wind, 6% solar, and 2% geothermal. So when we talk about wind and solar today, we are talking about 19% of 13% and 6% of 13%. So we're still talking about a very small amount of the total electricity produced in the United States. But what's most amazing about that is if we look at this, wind now is growing not just in terms of as a percentage, but in terms of actual installed capacity, faster than natural gas, and so it is the largest growing electricity producing resource in the United States. And just since 2008, the costs for installing it have dropped 41%. For distributed solar voltaics, just since 2008, the cost is down 54%. And for utility scale photovoltaics, down 64%. So the costs are decreasing rapidly. When you hear of talk of a coal renaissance, bringing back coal, these crashing numbers alone tell you that that will never happen because the economics have shifted very much towards alternative energy. The Department of Energy now estimates that wind will soon overtake hydropower as the leading source of clean electricity in the United States. And declining costs are leading to solar generation becoming the fastest growing source of electricity in the US, much more of it being driven via distributed sources than ever before. This, of course, from a sustainability perspective, we can talk about a lot of different things, but one area that we've talked about a lot over the last 2 days has, of course, been looking at the realm of carbon emissions and the future of climate change. And that's absolutely essential because the burning of coal in the United States and in China and in other large industrialized countries is, of course, one of the single largest contributing factors to global carbon pollution. But because of wind and solar expansion and the natural gas boom displacing coal, we're watching carbon emissions from electricity generation in the United States falling at a dramatic pace. It's really hard to know what the energy system is going to look like by 2050, but we certainly can expect that the energy system, and especially the electricity production system, will look incredibly different from what it looks like today. I'm going to go ahead now and turn to the panel with a couple first questions. We're going to start with Cela. We've seen dramatic changes in electricity in the United States and its generation over the past decade. Can you tell us more about the role the private sector is playing in the growth of wind and solar power in the US and what the investment prospects are for alternative power generation going forward?
Sure. The last 10 years, let me just categorize them in two broad categories. There's been some early stage venture capital-like investments from the private sector, especially prior to 2008, in some, what some people thought as new technology. And then there's the infrastructure investments, which is the type of investments that I predominantly do, building power plants, call it, in the electricity front. And those are solar power plants and wind power plants, et cetera, geothermal, et cetera. The venture capital portion of it all is not my specialty, but at the same time, the technology front has not grown all as much from a private investing perspective because there's been so much growth on the infrastructure side. And the infrastructure side, from a private investor's perspective, is a very solid fixed income investing, meaning these are power plants, fairly reliable, they work. Building a solar power plant versus building a natural gas power plant or a coal power plant is a lot easier, same with wind. The development cycle of a power plant, you know, depending on the state where you're in, from a permitting perspective, et cetera, is a lot shorter. There's been tremendous growth on the infrastructure side from private investing. A few things have actually, other than the type of investing, that's the secure kind of investing, that's a long-term electricity power plant investing, some things that propel the investment world in the private sector towards this type of investment are the federal incentives. Obviously, there's a federal tax credit that's been on and off, depending on the administration. But as you alluded to, as the cost of building wind and solar power plants have come down, we're at a position in the US right now where we don't really need any of these federal tax incentives. It has helped the industry and the private investment tremendously. It's undeniable as the industry picked up. But right now we're at a point, and there's a lot of discussion with the current administration whether they're going to get rid of some of these tax credits, et cetera. We're not really worried about it as investors in the private sector because even if it goes away, the costs have come down so much, and these technologies, call it, or the power plants have become so mainstream that they're still going to be cost competitive. They're still going to be attractive from a private investor's perspective, especially our and our investors' perspective going forward. The volume has helped a lot to bring the prices down. So we think, going forward, I think everybody in my industry, there's going to be a lot of money flowing into the industry to create jobs, to actually also help with the sustainability aspect of it. There's different trends that we're seeing, different types of investors that are coming into the market from a variety of perspectives. Not only institutional investors that want to put their money into work, but utilities. Some utilities used to be very much against it because it competed with their other investments in the coal and natural gas, et cetera, but now they're embracing it. Their deregulated arms are heavily invested in wind and solar, so as much as they compete with us, we're very happy to see them in the industry to make the industry grow from a private investing perspective. We also see large corporations who have actually in recent years have made commitments to be 100% renewable. For example, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart. These companies have made a dedication to actually purchase their powers from a distributed generation perspective from our power plants, and in many cases to put their own money and to build the power plants themselves to power their data centers, et cetera. There's different type of transactions that happen in the private sector in order to actually get the power from one location from the power plant to the end user. And we're welcoming all of these new innovations that are mostly propelled by corporate America, because they really want to reduce their carbon footprint. They want to have more security and control over their electricity usage. They just, they want to be sustainable.
Thanks. We'll pivot a little bit now with Phil, who's got some real experience with the policy side as well as the political side of energy. So Phil, federal policies have, as Cela alluded to, played an important role in the changes we've seen in the power grid to move towards a more sustainable energy system. What role do you see for the US government along with state governments in light of the recent election in continuing our move to a more sustainable energy system? And what prospects do you give for an infrastructure package that includes a smarter grid and continued expansion of renewable power as a part of it?
Well, thank you, Wesley, and I was very pleased to be invited here. Frankly, as a former member of Congress, I'm glad to be invited just about anywhere. But as I think people probably are aware, unless you've just turned your television off, as I did for about a week after the election, which might indicate where I was on this election cycle, it's very difficult to speculate, more so than almost any recent transition of power in the country, for a variety of reasons. And here I'm going to speak mainly about climate change, which in my view is the most compelling issue because we do not yet have a solid handle on it. And it's both in the energy sector as well as in the land use sector that I know you've been talking about. And let me suggest to you, partly out of this election, we got almost no discussion. Rather remarkably, American journalists failed in 3 presidential debates and a vice presidential debate to even ask one question on climate change, which I think President Obama would have said, "Come on, man, what's the deal? How could you miss something that important?" The second thing that we have is a situation that is very unusual, where usually there's an obvious kind of pool of people on one side of the political fence or the other on which you can expect the new administration to draw its political appointees. And so you have some rough idea. Here, that seems to be much more uncertain and much more wide open, and especially because there was such an internal struggle within the Republican Party over the nomination of President-elect Trump. But what we did have, of course, out of this election from his camp in particular were a number of very hostile comments about the science, about the war on coal, about various things that would suggest that the faction, the know-nothing faction, would would dominate after the election. I would suggest to you, I think that's highly improbable that they will dominate, and that the Republican leadership and the president will move away from that position for a variety of reasons. One is because the science is so solid now, so universally accepted, and public opinion in this country has been overwhelmingly, I mean 65 to 75% of Americans say you should be doing something about climate change. And of course, we have very aggressive state and local action in a variety of parts of the country, including this state here. And then, as Cela was pointing out, we now have a well-established renewables and efficiency industries and things of this sort, which are almost incumbent in technologies, not the old infant industry that was going to collapse if suddenly you didn't have full-scale subsidization. And then finally, by the way, something that worries people in industry is that activism is very likely to grow to be hostile to all kinds of energy projects in the country. Not that those will be successful in all the siting battles and whatnot that go on, and permitting battles, but that what we'll see is a very aggressive effort, because if you lack policy, then every molecule is equally bad. If you have wise policy, you can think of having a carbon budget or a methane budget, and realizing that some of that's okay and some of it's not if you're living within your budget. But let me just quickly suggest a broad outline, and this is pure speculation, and since most of you will never see me again, and frankly, as a member of Congress, why not just speculate? I'm not now, obviously. But one is that I do think it's unlikely that we will see out of this administration a continuation of the effort to actually restrain or restrict the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, in other words, carbon dioxide, fugitive methane emissions in production. Now, maybe they will sustain some of the regulatory apparatus to do that. Many people, I just headed up a think tank that was independent, nonpartisan, primarily economists who very strongly supported trying to put a price on carbon, for example, and these seem unlikely to happen under this administration, and that frankly, in my view, is a loss to the battle that we have to undertake. But as Cela pointed out, it's not at all yet clear, and there clearly are within the Republican Party strong supporters of various of the tax incentives that help solar and wind and geothermal in this country, and there's possibly strong support for continue the scientific endeavor. That is, we need to keep up with the science of what's happening around the world. We really do not have a full understanding of all of that, and we do need to keep up a research and development drive on technologies and long-term possibilities. You actually mentioned fusion when we were talking a little earlier. There are a whole variety of these possibilities, because I don't think anyone really believes, or at least let me put it this way, there certainly is no consensus among people that have looked at the policy outlook for the next 50 years as to exactly what path of technology or whatnot will get us where we probably need to go. And so therefore we need to be investing on this side. These things may continue. Also, as I already mentioned, the tax subsidies might as well. Something to very much keep in mind, of course, is that state government action is really quite significant in this country, state and local action, and that's not about to turn back. In fact, one of the experiences we had over the last 4 years was when the so-called Tea Party took over a number of state legislatures. One of the top priorities was the repeal of renewable portfolio standards, or what is called net metering, which is a subsidy for solar energy. And in almost every instance, they failed to do it. And one of the reasons they failed to do it was precisely because folks like Cela were on the ground, had jobs in their areas, and they suddenly said, whoa, this is not some conspiracy out of those left-wingers in Washington. This is actually something that has local importance here, kind of thing. So they politically survived, kind of thing. Let me just suggest, and I'll close quickly here, that there are probably three things that might be on the legislative agenda in Congress fairly quickly. One is some kind of tax bill. Some people argue for comprehensive tax reform. We'll see how comprehensive that is. It's very, very hard to accomplish, even when you have one-party control, because there'll be enormous divisions over that. And here what we just don't know is whether or not there might be an effort to repeal some of these tax proposals at the moment that continue to be important to renewables, to efficiency, and to other development of other things. The second, of course, is there may be an infrastructure bill, there may be multiple infrastructure bills, there almost certainly will be something. This is a high priority of President-elect Trump. It's something that has had almost universal agreement among Republicans and Democrats that this country must take seriously. There are big arguments over how to do it, how much should be public money, how much should be privately inspired kind of thing. And here, the question was, as Wesley put forth, is will some of that be directed toward things that might help improve the efficiency of the grid, smarten the grid, allow for more distributive generation and all kinds of facilities like that? Very hard to know. In 2009, those were a part of the stimulus package under the Obama administration, where those investments were encouraged in doing this kind of thing. But I think it is possible that what we will see is money might go into, for example, trying to advance the development of what's called the small modular nuclear reactor kind of thing. So there just could be a whole range of things. This is not likely to be presented by the administration. This is likely to be part of the bargaining process that happens in Congress and the Senate. Now, the third one is more problematic in my view, and I think will cause a political furor, and that is whether or not there will be a full frontal attack on the Clean Air Act to repeal its ability to regulate on greenhouse gases, which it's been doing in the absence of able to pass a carbon price, and whether that will happen. There, I can assure you there will be massive resistance to that in the political community and certainly among Democrats, but I even think some Republicans. But there may be adjustments in the Clean Air Act. This is an area that will be, my guess is not the first priority, but certainly lots of speeches were made, and in the last Congress there were a number of times that the House of Representatives passed legislation to restrict the Environmental Protection Agency, but that remains to be seen. Well, let me stop there and then and let us go on.
Thanks very much, Phil. Cela, one more question for you from me. As we look further into the future towards the year 2050, as we've been aiming to do at the symposium, what are some of the other technological advancements that you see coming where the private sector can help develop this more sustainable grid? Are there specific areas that you think are ripe for further development and are gaining notice within the investment community?
Yes, and I'm hesitant to say that these are technologically new advancements. I think they're not new, at least what I'm going to say is not new, but definitely at the forefront and now becoming mainstream to actually make solar and wind-related power generation to be non-intermittent. Storage is one of them. Storage is not new. I mean, this is, age-old batteries. And but it hasn't been commercially proven, it hasn't been economic, but now it's becoming very much so integrated with solar and wind so that we can actually have non-intermittent power supply. I think that's one of the main areas that we're going to see grow. Is it a new technology? Not really, but private sector is definitely going to be supporting that. And I believe utilities are going to be supporting that as well, because one of the biggest grievances from a technical perspective that the utilities have about our distributed generation power plants, when we plug into their distribution system, we put wind and solar, because the wind doesn't blow all the time or the sun doesn't shine all the time, we put a lot of stress into the transmission. And there's been a lot of talk about that, and over the years there's been a lot of investing on that as well. It's not new technology, but when there's locations where there's a lot of wind farms, transmission has been a problem, but it's been heavily invested on both by the public and the private sector. Now wind is coming back again because some of the transmission problems have been relatively resolved. So storage when it's combined with the wind and solar power generation, takes some of the stress out of the intermittent resource. And I think that's one of the other areas that we're going to see. More than technology, and maybe it's because what I do, we see a lot of innovation in transactions, in private transactions, where individuals can go and buy and pick their resource, electricity resource. For example, we're working on, and it's becoming very widely spread in different states, and as Phil said, I cannot stress the importance of state commitment, state-level commitment. That's a lot more important than the federal government giving us tax benefits, tax credits. Forget that. It's still going to work. We're a mature industry right now. The state-level commitment is a lot more important for us to grow. On the transactional front, for example, we work on something, as an example, called community solar. All of you are hearing about, oh, should I put panels on my roof? But I live in the Northeast. There's a lot of trees that are covering it. My roof is very old. I have an older home. There's a lot of snow. There's something called community solar, where and it's paired with net metering. We can build a big field on a landfill that's not being used. It's a closed landfill, a big solar power plant that can power all sorts of homes, and we can remotely provide solar power to different homes. No need to put on anything on your roof, no need to worry about shading, no need to worry about the snow, but we can still bring clean energy. There's a lot of state-level commitment, and there's a lot of innovation in those kinds of utility of the future, distributed generation, electricity being provided to households, corporations, et cetera. So we see a lot of innovation in that sense, at least from where I sit.
Great, thanks. I think we cannot stress enough the importance, based on the last two sets of comments, that a commitment to moving towards cleaner power, a lot of this can happen regardless of the federal government. And so one of the charges that we'll need to walk away from this meeting with is to, of course, remain engaged on these sustainability issues at the state and local level as well. To go from the state and local level to the international level, Phil, my last question before we open to the audience is, as we do look at the global level, what do you see as some of the trends that are helping shape a more global approach to expanding alternatives as a part of global energy production? And what are some of the institutions that you see leading this charge, and the biggest challenges these institutions are going to have to face as we work to really scale up renewables abroad?
Well, one thing, if I can just return to local, for those of you from New York, you're probably aware that this state at the moment is leading in at least the discussion of how one might transform the utility system and the grid. And the rest of the country and anybody in the business is watching very carefully that debate as it's been unfolding over the last couple years here. I think it's called the New Energy Vision, but the vision may have some astigmatism in it. So it's a question of what is it going to really look like. But it's a very significant, because not only is technology, as Cela said, changing, and how you operate these systems is changing. Just lots is changing, but the whole regulatory environment has to change, and that's pretty much a state level kind of decision. Very quickly on the international front, obviously the Paris Agreement was very significant. One has to remember it only took us 20 years to get international negotiations to the point that we finally got something that people agreed to overwhelmingly last December in the Paris Agreement. Now, the interesting thing about the Paris Agreement is it's really the only thing that we actually, as a nation, committed, or the president committed us to, which can be undone fairly easily, is just that we would make a pledge of what we will do. It's strictly up to our country to decide what that pledge is and whether we follow through on it. The same with all of the nations. So its strength, its political strength, has been it allowed everybody to come in because they can do what they want, and they try to commit and they try to influence each other, because it's called pledge and review, to get action. Now, so when the debate swirls around, will the U.S. pull out of Paris? I frankly think it'd be highly unlikely. There would be nothing gained from the critics' point of view in that process. What is a matter of importance going forward, this is one of the main institutional questions, is will the U.S. government play an activist role in trying to increase those pledges in the next 5-year round and to go forward, or is it going to just either play silent or even obstructionist? But it should be recognized that this whole thing does not depend on us alone, even though we are the second biggest emitter worldwide now. And the reason is other nations are really committed to this, and they're committed for a variety of reasons. Some of them because they see the imperative of mitigation, of having to adapt already, as frankly we're beginning to see that in the United States with rising sea level, and the flooding that comes with that. But the other part of that is that that people do look to us. But if you look at China and India and Indonesia and these other places, many, especially the big cities around the world, they have severe atmospheric problems because of coal burning and other fuel burning situations in which they have an imperative health-wise to bring this down. In fact, they have severe requirements for this. This is no game, and this is having political consequences for their leaders. So they are going to need to take action as on a clean air standpoint. That doesn't always happen, cut carbon dioxide emissions, but chances are it will, and it is in China already. The second part of this is that we are now in a global market. So the truth is that what happens in China and what happens elsewhere in their markets does come back to help or hurt us in our markets here. And if you look at the cost reduction in solar, in part that was driven by the Chinese subsidization of their development of their solar industry in their country, by the Spanish and the German policies, which incentivized enormously the buying and purchase of solar energy, which helped bring down the cut. And then we benefited from this in our economy. So nobody should get in their mind this old sort of American view. We develop all the technology, and if the rest of the world's lucky, we'll sell it to them or help bring them to them. That's just it was always nonsense, but it's especially nonsense today. We are integrated in these markets, and we'll keep it going. Also, it's on the international scene, the World Bank and other institutions, and while they are only small investors, the most of the money comes out of the private sector or out of the government treasuries of places like China. The truth is that they are very much committed to trying to help see that there is appropriate technology available, whether it's in Africa or Southeast Asia or in the so that we're going to continue to see this advance forward independent of what the U.S. government does. But do not underestimate the importance that we can and should play a role in this. And so if you have influence with people in your neighborhood or in your state or in your thing, the United States really ought to be a leader, not fall behind.
Thanks, Phil. At this point, we've got another 10 minutes, and we would love to open the floor to all of you and answer some questions about the future of the electricity grid and energy system.
Thank you for that enlightening discussion. I was wondering if you could comment on the national security implications of an optimized nationwide grid versus some people have called it islanding. Some people have referred to the ability to be resilient in the face of cyber attacks and so on, where different sectors of the U.S. can have its own power isolated from attacks on the wider grid. Because national security may be a way to moving us towards something that doesn't depend on global energy resources like coal and oil and other things.
Well, very quickly, two things. One is the actual fuel supply of whether it's coal, uranium, natural gas, or not, we really don't have to worry about that from a national security point of view. We got tons of it. We're exporting almost all of these things today, kind of thing. But from the grid operation, of the thing that you allude to, the cybersecurity thing is very real. And here the infrastructure bill might actually, it goes through Congress, may actually help subsidize some of these activities. One of them being the effort to try to make sure we have what is called these big transformers available in regional areas that can be moved in quickly, because if you could knock out some of these transformers, which you can do, by the way, with a rifle, you could end up having a blackout that's significant in an area for some time, kind of thing. Now, the reality is that the system is set up now to be island. I mean, back in 2003, was it, when we had the last big blackout? If the people in one of the Ohio utilities had been on their toes, they would have blacked out the local area just like that and saved everybody else from this. So you can island a system. System's set up to be able to break it down. But with what we're doing now with digitalization and internet, you've got to really make sure you have the protections. This is way beyond my ability to understand, but I think that that's going to be a high priority in national security and energy sectors. But it's another, what we call a security premium cost that you're going to have to put on your system, whether it's for those extra transformers that can be brought in for resilience purposes to rebuild quickly, or whether it's to try to step up your ability to protect the system from cyber attack. By the way, I mean, a smart teenager, we don't want them bringing down the smart grid.
Yeah.
I don't know the solution to the problem, but it's a real problem. Because I'll just give you a practical example about what we see. When we build a solar system, solar power plant, we have to plug it into the distribution system. And a lot of the times we have to go to a substation that's owned by the distribution company, the utility, majority of the time that we get our bills from. And some of these substations have not been touched for like 30, 40 years. They have no security around them. They're archaic. The good news about us is not a lot of people know this, because a lot of the times, we get a lot of grief. Oh, solar, wind adds cost to your bills, etc. But we upgrade these substations because we're the newcomers into the whole system. They tell us, if you want to plug into our distribution system, you need to upgrade it. Okay, we pay a lot of money, we upgrade the system, but the security is still not there. We bring it up to the 21st century technology, but they're very vulnerable. There's no security. Anybody can go there, and I wouldn't want to put any thoughts in anybody's mind, and it's been written before, but this is a huge national security problem that the private sector owners of these substations need to partake. Hopefully, the new infrastructure, outline that they're going to come with is going to address some of these things. We see it on a day-to-day basis. Not only they're archaic, but they're not protected.
By the way, that could be done by putting it on all of our electric bills by the local regulators and utilities. It doesn't have to be all subsidized out of the federal treasury. So just as there are various ways that we have traditionally paid for these things, and probably ought to, in my view.
I would second what they say, and the only thing that I would add is, unfortunately, the national security narrative around energy has been obsessively about this idea of energy independence. There's only 2 energy resources that the US imports in any meaningful amount. One of those is uranium, which is mostly coming from Australia and Canada into the United States, so I'm not very worried about that. And the other is oil, and the United States is, because of the fracking boom, producing well over 50% of the petroleum that we need domestically now. And the imports, our number 1 importing partner is Canada, and our number 2 partner is Mexico. And so again, the real national security concerns are around the grid and its vulnerability, as we have seen from the recent hackings that have now been able to hit things as simple as people's microwaves to bring down parts of the internet. And the vulnerability of the American power grid is particularly worrisome in the fact that the lower 48 is really only split into essentially 3 grids. And if you can bring down enough substations in any one of those 3, a huge part of the country could go black, and it could stay black for a long time, as we've watched in India, where the grid has gone down, and large swaths of India were out of power for 48 hours. And of course, obviously, that would be catastrophic here, because we've built up our infrastructure with the expectation that we have electricity all the time. We could not be sitting in this room having this conversation without it, because we don't have windows. And the cities that we live in today cannot function without that reliable flow of electricity. So it really does need to be a priority at the national level, but as well at the state and local level, to be able to diversify that, to be able to break the grid down into smaller pieces so that you can bring small parts off at a time if there's a problem, rather than a catastrophic kind of effect. Oh, we've got a microphone.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you for this panel. One of the concerns I have about the incoming administration, irrespective of whether the U.S. pulls out of Paris and irrespective of how we choose to power our grid domestically, is whether the U.S. would rescind payments toward climate financing through mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund in order to enable other countries to fulfill their Paris pledges. So I'm wondering if you would be able to comment on to what degree, if the U.S. were to rescind or draw down those payments, that would negatively impact the rest of the world and their ability to meet those pledges. Thank you very much.
Well, I just speculate that I would not count on the U.S. government to be a big contributor to that activity. It's been very difficult. It was very difficult in this administration to get any kind of commitment up to do that. There's the issue, naturally, the other countries, especially the developing countries, want that. They've made it a part of their bargain on the international scene. But the reality is that the Europeans, the United States, and others have been very, very slow to fulfill a variety of their international financial commitments through the United Nations. And so I would not bet my future that they will be big funders. Sorry about that.
I mean, on the other side of the coin, the one thing we have to remember is, besides central UN funding, a large amount of the renewables that we're seeing being installed in the developing world, especially in the least developed countries, is being financed in other ways. Solar even coming in through microcredit schemes, where an individual takes out a loan to get a solar panel that they put on the side of their house, and everyone in the village then pays that person to charge their cell phone, which is the only electronic device that they probably own at the house that has the solar panel. And so everything from microcredit schemes to private investment, to investment from the World Bank and directly through the different development agencies. And if the US changes the way in which we spend our development dollars over the next 4 years, other development agencies are going to pivot as well, and you can kind of move around the cups as to who's putting money in where. And so I think this is one area where I expect to see continued interest from European governments, from the Japanese, and from the Chinese, by the way, who are now spending a lot more money in this realm, that renewable energy is one of the areas where I expect to see more of that money flowing in the future, regardless of whether it comes through the Paris mechanisms or through something else. I think we have time for one more really quick question. We've got about 1 minute left.
One issue, if we could ever change our wasteful culture, let's start off with the fact that about 58% of the energy that we produce as a nation is not consumed at all, it's wasted. And when we pull that back and look at the electricity piece, let's not address the sources, let's address the sinks. And the largest sink to that happens to be our transmission system. Europe and Africa and other countries are moving to high voltage direct current. It's easier to on and offload renewables. You can run 1,500-mile transmission lines with almost no loss. They are much more cyber resilient and much easier to operate. So my overriding question is, are we just asleep at the wheel? And instead of plugging the dike from the wrong side and looking at other things, unless we change our behavior, it's not going to be an issue of what type of energy. It's going to be all of them and then some, because our appetite doesn't change.
I mean, I think so first of all, actually transmission loss has fallen off in the United States quite a bit if you look at the Energy Information Administration's data sets, which are incredible and free. Transmission loss was at one time accounting for about 50% of the total electricity production. It was just being shed between the power plant and the final destination. I mean, the one thing I think that really is changing in that regard, not only are we building out from some of these wind farms and solar farms DC lines that push it out to the local utilities, and you only transform it over to AC for that final trip from the substation to the consumer. But the other really big thing that's changing is that a lot of the waste was predicated around the dominance of coal and nuclear on the electricity grid. To ramp up a coal-fired power plant from 0 to 100% takes 24 to 48 hours, depending on the model, and the same thing goes for a nuclear power plant. I can do the same thing with a natural gas power plant in an hour. And so if we have wind and solar, and then you make up the difference with natural gas, you can actually modulate the amount of electricity that you produce on an hourly basis in a way that we could only do with hydro for most of the last 100 years. And that is a really important part of what we're going to have to do. Right now, when you live in a place where coal power is your primary source of power, the utility has to run those power plants at the level that meets peak demand. So they have to estimate what is going to be the point over the next 24 hours with the highest demand, and they have to produce full out at that, and all the rest just goes to waste right now. And the good news is that especially as storage gets better, we can bank wind and solar during the hours when they're producing the best, and then consume it at the time that we need, and we can make up the difference with natural gas, which we can bring up and down quite rapidly. And those changes, I think, are going to be absolutely essential to overcoming the waste that we have within the American electricity system.
But I mean, I think to address your point, the reality is, yes, we're very behind. The U.S. has been historically behind because some of the developing, populated developing world, China and India, as Phil alluded to, they're doing this out of necessity. They have no choice. They have to do this, especially distributed generation in remote locations. There's no other choice for them. There's no infrastructure. We live in a great country. Well, a lot of people don't think that, but we do, and we have infrastructure, actually. So it wasn't a necessity for the U.S. to do renewables, other than the fact that we're one of the biggest pollutants. So, the Obama government made a big push for it. But we are behind on the cybersecurity front, on the transmission front, and all that kind of stuff. Is it going to be included? Do they view this as an infrastructure investment in the current government? We have yet to see, hopefully.
But of course, here's one of our practical situations in the United States, and we are a gigantic country, which you have to remember that, is we have not allowed for the centralization, especially in electricity. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, while it regulates some of this and some of the transmission, what we really run into is we have state regulation that is very influential over this. We have a huge problem of sometimes siting of this is viewed as the problem, but siting is not as big a problem as I understand it as cost allocation. In other words, who's going to pay for this transmission system? Are we going to put it on her and the solar people, or are we going to put it on who are? And this has led to somewhat, some people would argue, underdevelopment and slow to change. On the positive side, we have so many opportunities to save and be more efficient and less wasteful. And so in some ways, we have areas that we can capitalize on and still maintain a lifestyle that some people think is rather excessive.
Thank you very much to our panel and to the audience for your questions. Obviously, as these symposia continue out over the coming years, energy questions are going to continue to come up in other ways. So we'll look forward to continuing the conversation in a different direction next year.
Thank you, Wes, and your panel.